My daughter collapsed on stage at her nursing school graduation. Everyone said it was stress, but I knew the truth was far more sinister. This was no ordinary stress. This was because the school's partner hospital was using students as free labor for grueling 40-hour shifts, relentlessly exploiting their dreams. And what I did next, with just 6 words, brought down 2 powerful institutions. But before I tell you how, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we tell here. Have you subscribed yet? Thank you for being part of our community. Now let me tell you. I never thought watching my daughter achieve her dreams would become the moment everything fell apart. 2 years Emma had poured into nursing school, countless late nights hunched over textbooks at our kitchen table, sacrificing so much she never spoke about. As I sat in the 3rd row of the Riverside Nursing Academy auditorium, my chest swelled with a familiar pride, watching her stride across that stage. She looked radiant in her crisp white uniform, the one we'd picked out with such anticipation. The air hummed with celebration, families cheering, cameras flashing, the palpable promise of new beginnings. Yet, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach the instant I saw Emma's face as she approached the podium. Her usual bright smile was a fragile mask, and her hand gripped the railing with a white-knuckled desperation that made my heart clench. When Director Linda Hartwell called her name, Emma took 3 faltering steps forward, then simply crumpled. The sickening thud of her body hitting the wooden stage will forever echo in my nightmares. Chaos erupted. Parents gasped, students screamed, their joy turning to horror. My nursing instincts, honed over decades in the ER, surged forward, propelling me through the desperate crowd toward the stage. Emma lay inert, her face a shocking shade of ashen, her breathing shallow and ragged, signs that screamed of a crisis far beyond mere fatigue. Director Hartwell was already kneeling, speaking in urgent whispers into her phone, her back to the rising panic. "It's just stress," she announced, her voice, usually so authoritative, now strained. "These students pushed themselves so hard during finals week." But my gut screamed otherwise. I knew my daughter. This wasn't the picture of academic pressure. As paramedics carefully loaded Emma onto a stretcher, my gaze locked onto something that turned my blood to ice. Director Hartwell was now locked in an intense, hushed exchange with Pat Morrison, my own supervisor from St. Mary's Hospital, who had materialized seemingly out of nowhere. Their faces weren't etched with concern. They wore an unmistakable mask of pure, unadulterated panic, like conspirators watching their meticulously built edifice begin to fracture. At the hospital, Emma was stable. Yet her exhaustion ran deeper than any doctor could diagnose. They mumbled about dehydration and extreme fatigue, recommending rest. But sitting by her bedside, watching her frail sleep, a chilling certainty settled over me. Something profoundly wrong, something far more sinister, was unfolding. Emma had always been a force of nature, resilient, tackling challenges with a fierce determination I both admired and envied. To see her so utterly broken, so completely drained, twisted my insides. When she finally stirred, her first words weren't about her graduation or her dreams. They were a whispered, heartbreaking apology. "I'm sorry, Mom," she choked out, tears silently tracing paths down her temples. I tried to make it through the ceremony, but I just couldn't anymore. That single word, anymore, reverberated through me, suggesting a chronic agony, a culmination of weeks, perhaps months, of hidden suffering. I squeezed her hand, promising we'd face this together, but a cold dread told me I was about to assemble a puzzle whose pieces I truly feared. The next morning, while Emma slept, a restless urge drove me back to the auditorium to retrieve her phone, left behind in the chaos. I knew she'd want it, a small piece of normalcy amidst the wreckage. As I reached under her chair, its screen pulsed with an insistent glow. My eyes snagged on the notifications, and a prickle of unease turned into a full-blown chill. Message after message from her classmates flooded the screen, their hushed tones betraying an unspoken conspiracy. Shifts, hours, and a chilling refrain about keeping quiet until after graduation. One message from her friend Katie hit me like a physical blow. "Girl, I can't believe you made it through yesterday. After that 48-hour shift at St. Mary's, I would have collapsed too." Then Jake, her study partner. "The whole class is talking. Do you think they'll still make us work the weekend shifts now that we've graduated?" My hands began to tremble uncontrollably as I scrolled, each message painting a horrifying picture I was completely blind to. These weren't just study groups or typical student jobs. They were detailed discussions of mandatory, grueling shifts, thinly veiled threats about failing grades, and a pervasive exhaustion that clawed far beyond any normal academic pressure. The messages unspooled a systematic pattern of abuse that turned my stomach. Emma and her peers were coerced into what they called clinical rotations, brutal, unbroken stretches of 36 to 48 hours without rest or compensation. Director Hartwell, they reported, dismissed their suffering, spinning these shifts as character building and essential for real-world nursing experience. But the insidious undercurrent was the constant, suffocating threat. Students who dared to complain, who tried to reclaim their lives, were told their grades would plummet, their recommendations would be poisoned, and their fledgling careers would be dead before they even began. A message from Emma's friend Sarah seared into my mind. I tried to tell my mom, but Director Hartwell called her and explained it was all part of the intensive training program we signed up for. Now my mom thinks I'm just complaining. Reading these words, a searing rage ignited within me. My daughter and her classmates weren't just overworked. They were trapped in a meticulously crafted system designed to exploit them, held captive by the very future they so desperately craved. As I drove home, the car a metal cage around my escalating fury, my mind reeled. How long had this been festering? How many bright young minds had been crushed in this silent grinder? And who, besides Hartwell and Morrison, was complicit? Every exhausted slump Emma had taken, every dinner she'd fallen asleep over, every family event she'd missed because of mandatory clinical hours, it all clicked into a sickening mosaic. I'd seen her dedication, admired her relentless pursuit of a dream, never once suspecting she was being systematically dismantled. Guilt, a cold, heavy stone, lodged in my chest. As a nurse myself, I should have recognized the glaring signs of overwork, the telltale exhaustion that spoke of more than just finals. I should have pushed, questioned, fought harder. I should have protected my daughter from a system I, unknowingly, was a cog in. But the guilt quickly coalesced into a molten core of determination. This could not, would not, happen to another student, another family, another hopeful daughter sacrificing everything to help others, only to be exploited by the very institutions sworn to teach her. Reaching home, I found Emma awake, a fragile but undeniable alertness in her eyes as she sat at the kitchen table. "Mom," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk." I sat opposite her, placing her phone, the silent witness to her agony, gently between us. "I know," I said, the words heavy with unspoken understanding. "I saw the messages." For the first time in what felt like years, a fragile relief, not exhaustion, washed over her face. She began to unravel the whole tangled thread of lies, the impossible hours, the chilling threats, the insidious narrative that complaining would shatter their careers before they even started. She described how the partnership between Riverside Nursing Academy and St. Mary's Hospital, sold as invaluable real-world experience, had metastasized into a sophisticated racket, providing both institutions with free, skilled labor while charging students exorbitant tuition for the privilege. With every word she spoke, the reality hit me harder. My own workplace, the hospital where I'd poured nearly 2 decades of my life, was actively complicit in the predatory exploitation of young people aspiring to walk in my footsteps. The betrayal cut to my very core, both professional and personal, shattering everything I thought I knew about the institutions I had trusted with my career and my daughter's future. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of research, hushed phone calls, and a mounting horror as the true, grotesque scope of Emma's and her classmates' ordeal unfurled before me. My first step was reaching out to other parents, carefully probing about their children's experiences in the nursing program. The pattern that emerged was chillingly consistent: exhausted students, concerned families placated with soothing lies, and a deliberate, systematic campaign to keep parents utterly ignorant of the monstrous reality. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son Miguel was in Emma's class, broke down in gut-wrenching sobs when I dared to mention the extended shifts. "I knew something was terribly wrong," she wailed. Miguel lost 20 pounds during his final semester, but every single time I called the school, Director Hartwell assured me it was just normal for students to be challenged during clinical rotations. Each conversation, each tearful admission, added another piece to a puzzle of institutional betrayal so vast, so calculating, it defied belief. Driven by a cold, righteous anger, I plunged deeper, using my employee access to pry into the shadowed financial relationship between Riverside Nursing Academy and St. Mary's Hospital. What I unearthed made my blood run cold, a bitter bile rising in my throat. These so-called student clinical rotations weren't educational. They were a cynical charade, strategically deployed to plug gaping holes in the hospital's staffing during its busiest, most under-resourced periods. These bright, dedicated students were functioning as unlicensed nurses, burdened with patient care responsibilities that should have been handled by fully qualified, paid staff. The hospital was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars in labor costs, while the nursing school gorged itself on full tuition fees from students who, unbeknownst to them, were providing free, invaluable labor. And the most sickening twist? Pat Morrison, my longtime supervisor, the woman I'd trusted, was signing off on these arrangements, her bank account swelling with bonus payments for educational coordination. Money directly tied to the sheer volume of student hours she could squeeze out for the hospital. The betrayal was now a gaping wound, knowing someone I'd worked shoulder to shoulder with for years was actively profiting from the brutal exploitation of my own daughter. The documentation I painstakingly pieced together exposed a sophisticated, meticulously constructed system designed to obliterate any trace of the truth. Official records, submitted to the state nursing board, painted a pristine picture. Students working the legally mandated maximum of 20 hours per week in clinical settings. But the hospital's internal scheduling system screamed a different, horrifying story. A clandestine network where students were routinely shunted into grueling 36 and 48-hour shifts, their time cleverly fractured across multiple departments, hours cunningly logged under different supervisors to evade detection. The paperwork itself was a labyrinth of deliberate complexity, a bureaucratic smokescreen designed to make it utterly impossible for any regulatory agency to unearth the violations without an insider's map of its convoluted pathways. It became sickeningly clear. Emma and her classmates weren't merely being overworked, they were being systematically defrauded, pouring their hard-earned tuition into an education while unknowingly serving as hundreds of hours of unpaid labor, in flagrant violation of both educational standards and fundamental labor laws. The sheer audacity, the chilling precision of this cover-up, hinted at years of insidious practice, affecting countless students who had graduated, silently broken, long before Emma's class. As I dug deeper, the bitter taste of institutional indifference coated my tongue. I unearthed a disturbing pattern. Several brave students had attempted to report the excessive hours to various authorities, only to have their desperate pleas dismissed, buried, or contemptuously swept aside. There was Ashley Chen, a former student whose complaint to the state nursing board 2 years prior had vanished without a trace. Director Hartwell, I discovered, had brazenly countered Ashley's legitimate concerns with a fabricated narrative, painting her as a problem student riddled with attitude issues and making false accusations to avoid academic responsibility. The nursing board, in a sickening display of institutional allegiance, had sided unequivocally with the school, burying Ashley's complaint as unfounded. I found identical patterns with 3 other students who had dared to speak up, each systematically discredited, their academic records savaged, their characters assassinated, their desperate complaints erased. These institutions had perfected a diabolical system, students who remained silent, endured, and graduated, vanishing into their careers. But those who dared to whisper the truth, they were ruthlessly professionally annihilated before their careers could even begin. It was a chilling masterclass in institutional gaslighting, perfected over years of insidious, ruthless practice. The most visceral jolt came when I stumbled upon the financial records Pat Morrison had carelessly left exposed on her office computer. The educational partnership between Riverside Nursing Academy and St. Mary's Hospital wasn't a partnership at all. It was a cynical transaction. Direct payments flowed from the hospital to the school, a chilling per-hour bounty based on student participation hours. For every single hour a student toiled beyond the legal 20-hour limit, the hospital funneled a fee to the school, cynically masked as enhanced educational supervision. In brutal reality, this supervision was a phantom, minimal or utterly non-existent. Students frequently abandoned to manage complex patient care independently, while regular, paid staff were strategically reassigned to other duties. The financial incentive structure was a monstrous perversion. Both institutions reaped greater profits when students were worked longer, harder, creating a grotesque system where student welfare was not just secondary, but diametrically opposed to institutional financial interests. Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison weren't merely permitting this exploitation. They were actively, financially incentivized to maximize it, coldly calculating every dollar of profit from shattered dreams and broken bodies. I spent countless frenzied hours meticulously compiling every shred of evidence. The chilling financial arrangements, the brazenly falsified records, the systematic, brutal suppression of every dissenting voice, the devastating health impacts scarring the students. But I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that evidence alone was a fragile thing. I needed a platform, a megaphone that could blast this truth into the public consciousness, in a way that defied suppression, defied discredit, defied burial, unlike all the desperate cries that had come before. The institutions were colossi, with sprawling power, tangled connections, and decades of brutal expertise in silencing critics. My mind replayed the chilling fates of Ashley Chen and the others, their futures cruelly annihilated by the very people who were supposed to uplift them. I refused to let that happen to Emma or to any other unsuspecting student. Yet, I also couldn't risk my meticulously gathered proof being shrugged off as the ravings of a disgruntled employee or an overprotective mother. I needed an unassailable stage, a narrative stronghold that would leave Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison utterly powerless to control the story or silence the truth. The solution, a sudden, blinding flash of insight, struck me while watching the local evening news. Channel 7 was running a follow-up piece on Emma's collapse at graduation, framed as a saccharine human interest story about student stress and academic pressure. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, completely missed the insidious rot beneath the surface, but her unwitting interest, combined with the raw, public spectacle of Emma's collapse, had inadvertently forged an unprecedented opportunity, a platform previous complainants could only have dreamed of. If I could guide Jennifer, steer her towards the right questions during a live interview, I could unleash the unvarnished truth in a format immune to editing, immune to suppression, immune to the institution's iron-fisted control. The key was a calculated balance of timing and strategy. I had to present myself as a heartbroken mother, sharing her painful perspective, not as a vengeful accuser launching a prepared attack. I called Channel 7, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, and agreed to the interview, knowing this was my single, fleeting chance to expose the truth in a way that could not, would not, be silenced. The days leading up to the television interview became a torturous tightrope walk between meticulous preparation and maintaining a facade of utter normalcy. Beneath my calm exterior, a molten rage simmered, a constant, burning heat. I continued my regular shifts at St. Mary's, each interaction with Pat Morrison a surreal, agonizing performance. I watched her, through new, hardened eyes, moving through her daily routine, utterly oblivious that I knew every damning detail of her role in exploiting students like Emma. Every forced smile, every casual question she posed about Emma's recovery, felt like a perverse theatrical piece. Knowing this woman, feigning concern, was one of the cruel architects of the system that had nearly destroyed my daughter's life. The hardest part was witnessing her sign off on more student schedules, each stroke of her pen a fresh betrayal, feeding another young, eager soul into the grinder, into a system expertly designed to cannibalize their dedication and dreams. But I knew, with chilling clarity, that maintaining this fragile cover was paramount. Any flicker of suspicion would grant them precious time to incinerate evidence, to craft their own insidious narrative. My evenings were a relentless rhythm. First, coaching Emma through her physical and emotional recovery. Then, in the stolen hours of darkness, preparing for the interview that would detonate everything. She grew stronger each day, but the invisible scars of her ordeal, the psychological impact, surfaced with heartbreaking clarity as she finally dared to speak her truth. "Mom," she confessed one evening, her voice raw, "I used to love nursing. I dreamt of helping people, of making a difference, just like you do. But by the end of that program, I was so utterly exhausted, so bitterly disillusioned, that I started to hate it. I felt like a complete failure, a weak student, because I couldn't handle what they claimed was normal for the profession." Hearing how this insidious exploitation had systematically poisoned her innate passion, twisted her noble aspirations into trauma and disillusionment, solidified my resolve into an unyielding steel. This wasn't just about labor violations or financial fraud. This was about the theft of vibrant young dreams, replaced with a crushing burden of psychological wreckage. Emma's collapse wasn't merely physical exhaustion. It was the harrowing moment her body finally, defiantly, refused to participate in its own slow, agonizing destruction. My research spiraled beyond merely documenting the present horror, delving into the insidious origins of this system, desperately seeking to understand how it had metastasized and persisted for so long. I discovered that the Enhanced Clinical Experience program had been birthed 5 years prior, a convenient progeny of desperate budget cuts at the hospital and a surge in enrollment at the nursing school. What had likely begun, deceptively, as a genuine attempt to provide students with more hands-on experience, had gradually, almost imperceptibly, warped into systematic exploitation as both institutions tasted the intoxicating sweetness of financial gain. The progression was diabolically insidious. Each passing year, the hours subtly stretched, the supervision marginally thinned, the financial incentives bloated into grotesque proportions. Students and their unsuspecting families, conditioned by small, incremental changes, remained tragically unaware of how far the program had drifted from legitimate education, plummeting headlong into outright labor trafficking. By the time Emma's class entered this perverted pipeline, grueling 40-plus-hour shifts had become so thoroughly normalized, so ingrained in the perverse culture, that any student who buckled under the impossible weight was cruelly told they weren't cut out for nursing, rather than anyone acknowledging the brutal, illegal, and utterly unreasonable demands being foisted upon them. I also unearthed a chilling truth. I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last, hospital employee to sense the deep-seated rot. 2 nurses, both courageous and principled, had lodged internal complaints about the student program over the preceding 3 years, their voices ringing with desperate concerns for patient safety and student welfare. Both complaints, I found, had been callously dismissed by the administration, swept under a thick rug of denial. And, in a chilling act of retaliation, both nurses had subsequently been exiled, their careers shunted to less desirable shifts and departments. One nurse, Maria Santos, had been particularly vocal, her warnings echoing with fierce indignation about students being recklessly assigned responsibilities far beyond their training levels. Her concerns, however, were brutally dismissed as resistance to innovative educational partnerships. When I discreetly reached out to Maria, her voice, etched with a quiet bitterness, confirmed my deepest suspicions and then unspooled even more disturbing details. Students, she revealed, were being used as desperate stopgaps, covering critical staffing shortages during the chaotic, unsupervised nights and weekends. I tried to speak up, Maria confided, her voice hollow, but they made it crystal clear. Questioning the program was questioning the hospital's sacred commitment to education. They painted me as someone who was against helping students learn. The most crucial, agonizing part of my preparation revolved around anticipating the inevitable onslaught. How Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison would lash out once the truth detonated. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, they would attempt to dismantle me personally, to weaponize my profound love for Emma, framing my revelations as the hysterical cries of an overprotective mother. They would twist my every word, dismiss my insights as the ramblings of someone who didn't understand the convoluted complexities of modern nursing education. They would undoubtedly claim the extended hours were voluntary, that supervision was rigorous, that any problems were isolated anomalies, certainly not systemic abuses. I fortified myself against these predictable attacks, meticulously gathering heart-wrenching testimonials from other parents and students. I documented the labyrinthine financial arrangements with unassailable precision and cross-referenced every single piece of evidence, ensuring it was so overwhelmingly comprehensive that it could not, under any circumstances, be dismissed as mere misunderstanding or wild exaggeration. I also reached out to Ashley Chen, the brave former student whose complaint had been so ruthlessly buried. With a quiet strength born of past pain, she agreed to go on record, her testimony providing irrefutable corroboration that this predatory system was neither a recent anomaly nor an isolated incident, but a deeply entrenched, terrifying pattern. As the interview date loomed, a growing hum of anticipation, mingled with a profound unease, filled me. I found myself not just rehearsing what I would say, but meticulously crafting how I would deliver each word, each nuance. I understood that a performance too polished, too overtly angry, would hand them the ammunition they craved, an excuse to dismiss me as a woman consumed by a personal agenda, rather than a grieving parent speaking uncomfortable truths. The delicate balance lay in appearing utterly genuine, spontaneously reacting to Jennifer's questions, while every revelation was, in fact, precisely planned, strategically timed. I practiced telling Emma's raw story, letting her vulnerability naturally unfurl, then subtly guiding the conversation to broader, systemic questions about the nursing program. Each strategic pause, each carefully chosen phrase, was designed to bait Jennifer into asking the follow-up questions that would unlock the floodgates, allowing me to unleash increasingly damning information. But above all, I meticulously honed the 6 words that would serve as the devastating crescendo of my revelation. A simple, direct, undeniable statement, a truth so stark it would be impossible to misinterpret or dismiss. This truth, I knew, would be delivered at the precise moment when Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison, watching their world unravel in real time, would realize their carefully constructed empire of lies was on the precipice of utter collapse. The night before the interview, a profound silence filled our home as I sat Emma down, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to do. "Mom," she began, her voice barely a whisper, a tremor of fear in it. "Are you truly sure about this? They're going to come after you. They'll try to destroy your career, just like they did to every student who dared to complain. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her, and for the first time in months, I saw the resilient fire, the unyielding strength returning to her eyes. In that moment, I knew I had no choice. "Emma?" I replied, my voice steady, imbued with a conviction that ran bone deep. I've spent 18 years building a career in a system I believed was dedicated to healing, to helping people. If that very system is, in fact, designed to exploit and break young, hopeful souls like yours, then it's not worth protecting. Some things, my dear, are simply more important than job security, more important than fear. That night, sleep was a fleeting, mocking stranger. My mind raced, replaying every scenario, every calculated move, preparing for the dawn that would either expose a monstrous truth or utterly shatter my own future. But for the first time since Emma's agonizing collapse, a profound sense of purpose settled over me. I was finally taking action, an unstoppable force fueled by the righteous anger and unyielding determination that had been building within me for weeks. The morning of the interview dawned with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the icy gravity settling in my soul. I dressed with deliberate care, pulling on my nursing scrubs, not because I was scheduled for a shift, but because I needed to embody exactly who I was. A dedicated working nurse, a heartbroken but determined mother, not some ideologue or personal avenger. As I navigated the familiar streets towards the Channel 7 studios, my mind was a swirling vortex of faces. All the silent sufferers, all the deceived parents, all the future students who would be ground down by this same predatory system if I failed. The immense weight of responsibility pressed down on me, yet it was matched, paradoxically, by an exhilarating clarity of purpose that had forged itself in the crucible of Emma's collapse. I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that within the next hour, I would either ignite a firestorm of justice against systemic abuse or immolate my own career in a failed, futile attempt. Either way, there would be no turning back from this precipice. Jennifer Walsh greeted me in the studio with the kind of polished, professional warmth that television reporters perfect over years of expertly feigned empathy. She explained, with practiced poise, that the interview would be broadcast live during the noon news segment, allotting us approximately 8 minutes to delve into Emma's collapse and subsequent recovery. "We're really interested in the human side of this story, Margaret," she purred, her eyes earnest, the immense pressures students face, and how families cope with such profound academic stress. I nodded, a tight, controlled smile fixed on my lips, knowing with an almost perverse satisfaction that she had absolutely no idea she was about to unwillingly broadcast the biggest, most explosive story of her entire career. As the makeup artist meticulously worked on my face, I ran through my meticulously crafted strategy one final, crucial time. Begin with Emma's heartbreaking story. Establish my credibility as a grieving, concerned parent. Then, with surgical precision, gradually, seamlessly peel back the layers to reveal the systematic, monstrous nature of what had truly transpired. The critical art lay in making each devastating revelation appear as an organic, unplanned response to Jennifer's sympathetic questions, rather than a calculated, prepared assault on the powerful institutions involved. The interview began precisely as I had orchestrated, with Jennifer's questions laced with a carefully constructed sympathy, probing Emma's collapse and her arduous recovery. I spoke with brutal honesty, my voice imbued with raw emotion, recounting the agony of watching my daughter's dreams transform into a nightmare of unconsciousness and exhaustion. I described the chilling fear, the pervasive confusion that had consumed me in that horrifying moment, and the profound, enduring pride I still held for Emma's unwavering dedication to nursing. "Emma has always been someone who pours her entire soul into what she believes in," I stated, my gaze steady. "And I think that's precisely what made her so terribly vulnerable to what ultimately happened." Jennifer nodded, her expression deepening with a well-practiced sympathy, then tossed me the perfectly telegraphed softball question. She asked about the academic pressures that had ostensibly led to Emma's collapse. This was it. This was my opening. "Well, Jennifer," I began, my voice calm, deceptively steady. At first, I clung to the belief it was simply academic pressure. But then, I discovered the horrifying truth. Emma and her classmates were being forced to work 48-hour shifts at St. Mary's Hospital as part of their clinical rotations. That, Jennifer, isn't academic pressure. That is systematic exploitation. I watched Jennifer's face, her professional mask subtly cracking, as the dawning realization of the true, monstrous story hit her. 48-hour shifts, Jennifer repeated, her journalistic instincts, now fully activated, cutting through her practiced calm. That seems grossly excessive for students. Are you alleging this was a requirement of the nursing program? I nodded gravely, my gaze unwavering. Not only required, but students were explicitly threatened, complain about the hours, or try to reduce them, and face failing grades and poisoned recommendations that would utterly destroy their career prospects before they even started. My daughter and her entire class were essentially trapped. Jennifer. They had a stark choice. Either submit to brutal exploitation or surrender their lifelong dreams of becoming nurses. Jennifer leaned forward, her composure now completely abandoned, her eyes wide with the raw recognition that this story dwarfed anything she had anticipated. "Have you brought these grave concerns to the school administration?" she pressed, her voice urgent. This was it. This was the precise, terrifying moment I had meticulously prepared for. "Jennifer," I stated, my eyes locking directly into the camera lens, knowing they were watching. "I work at St. Mary's Hospital. I have personally seen the internal documents. This isn't a misunderstanding, nor is it an isolated incident. This is a systematic, institutional program where the hospital and nursing school are actively profiting from student labor, while shamelessly falsifying records to conceal their illegal activities from regulatory agencies." The studio fell into an almost unbearable silence, broken only by the low hum of the cameras and the frantic ticking of the clock. Jennifer, to her immense credit, immediately grasped the shattering significance of my revelation. "You're alleging a profound financial arrangement between St. Mary's Hospital and Riverside Nursing Academy that involves the exploitation of student labor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. "I'm not alleging it," I countered calmly, my voice resonating with an undeniable authority. "I am stating it as fact. The hospital pays the nursing school directly, a specific fee calculated based on how many hours students work beyond the legal 20-hour limit. Both institutions profit exponentially when students are forced to work longer, more brutal hours, creating a perverse system where student welfare is not just disregarded, but directly, fundamentally opposed to their institutional financial interests. Students like Emma aren't receiving an education, Jennifer. They are providing free labor, all while paying exorbitant tuition for the horrifying privilege." I could practically see the gears turning in Jennifer's mind, the immense implications of my words dawning on her. Recognizing this was a story with potential national, even international, repercussions. "Do you possess documentation to substantiate these grave claims?" she asked, her voice now a hushed demand. "I possess comprehensive documentation," I replied, my voice unwavering, "and I am prepared to provide every single shred of it to any regulatory agency or law enforcement organization that dares to launch an investigation." Jennifer, her journalistic fire now blazing, pressed me with several more sharp, incisive questions about the granular specifics of my discoveries. I provided clear, unvarnished, factual answers, each word painting a more horrifying picture of systematic, deeply entrenched institutional abuse. I detailed the brazenly falsified records, the cynical suppression of every previous cry for help, the insidious financial incentives that fueled this grotesque exploitation, and the devastating, long-term health impacts scarring countless students. Throughout the entire, fraught interview, I meticulously maintained the carefully crafted persona of a deeply concerned parent, speaking from a place of raw, personal experience, rather than an accuser launching a premeditated attack. This nuanced approach, this balance of pain and quiet resolve, rendered my revelations even more potent, more undeniably credible. As the interview neared its planned conclusion, Jennifer posed the question I had anticipated, the moment I had meticulously prepared for. "What, Margaret, would you say to the administrators at both institutions, who are almost certainly watching this interview right now?" I looked directly, unflinchingly, into the camera lens, my gaze burning with the accumulated agony of weeks, knowing that Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison were almost certainly staring back, trapped, horrified. And then, I delivered the 6 words, the devastating truth I had so painstakingly crafted, words that would forever shatter their carefully constructed edifice of lies. "They're stealing our children's futures for profit." The brutal simplicity, the undeniable directness of that statement made it utterly impossible to misinterpret, impossible to dismiss. And I knew, with a fierce certainty, that everyone watching understood precisely the monstrous accusation I had just unleashed. As the interview concluded, the cameras finally ceasing their hungry gaze, Jennifer immediately sprang into action, her phone already pressed to her ear, frantically making calls to follow up on the explosive story. "Margaret," she exclaimed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of exhilaration and awe, "this is monumental. We need statements from the hospital and the nursing school, and we need to verify your documentation. Are you truly prepared for the absolute firestorm that's about to break loose?" I nodded, a strange cocktail of profound relief and chilling apprehension washing over me. "I've been preparing for this exact moment, Jennifer, since the day Emma collapsed," I replied, my voice hoarse with emotion. "I know, with absolute certainty, they will attempt to destroy my credibility, to obliterate my career. But some things, Jennifer, are simply more important than job security. Some truths must be told." As I walked out of the studio, the humid Oregon air feeling strangely crisp, I knew my life, in a matter of hours, would be irrevocably altered. Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison would be scrambling in a desperate, futile attempt to control the irreparable damage. Regulatory agencies would be hounding them with questions they could not easily evade, and countless other parents and students would finally find the undeniable validation they needed, the courage to shatter their own silence. The confrontation I had meticulously, painfully built towards for weeks was finally over, but the true, brutal battle had only just begun. The response to the interview was immediate, a tsunami of public outrage and vindication that crashed down with overwhelming force. Within hours, Channel 7's phone lines were jammed, inundated with calls from other parents, from former students, from current nursing students across the state, all echoing chillingly similar experiences. Jennifer Walsh, her voice buzzing with an almost disbelieving excitement, called me that evening to inform me that the story had been devoured by national news outlets, and that federal agencies were already launching serious inquiries into the grave allegations I had dared to raise. "Margaret," she breathed, "you've ripped open a door that countless people have been desperately trying to force open for years. The Department of Education and the Department of Labor are both launching full-scale investigations, and there's already serious talk of establishing a federal task force dedicated to student exploitation in healthcare education programs nationwide." As I listened, my heart swelling with a strange mix of vindication and profound responsibility, I knew my mission was far from over. I had succeeded in exposing the hideous truth, but now a heavier mantle fell upon me. I had to ensure that this momentum, this fleeting spotlight, culminated in genuine, systemic change, not just a transient wave of public attention. The institutional response was precisely what I had braced myself for, yet its sheer viciousness still scraped at my raw nerves. By the following morning, Both St. Mary's Hospital and Riverside Nursing Academy had unleashed official statements, dripping with scorn, shamelessly characterizing my allegations as unfounded accusations from a disgruntled employee, and the misguided concerns of an overprotective parent who clearly doesn't comprehend modern nursing education. Director Hartwell herself, a chillingly composed figure, appeared on the very same news program where I had spoken my truth, artfully casting herself as a dedicated, benevolent educator, being unjustly assailed by an individual with personal grievances against the venerable institutions she served. Pat Morrison, through the hospital's cold legal department, issued a statement questioning my very mental state, callously suggesting that my emotional instability following Emma's collapse had warped my perception, leading me to misinterpret routine educational procedures as something sinister. They were following the same nauseating playbook they had used to brutally discredit every brave complainant before me. But this time, the stage was national, the audience vast, and the spotlight unforgiving. Their meticulously orchestrated attempts to discredit me backfired with spectacular, devastating force. Within days, other courageous hospital employees began stepping out of the shadows, their voices rising to corroborate my explosive allegations. Maria Santos, the nurse who had been ruthlessly transferred after bravely speaking out against the student program, agreed to an interview, her testimony providing damning, additional documentation concerning patient safety risks and the students' brutal exploitation. 3 other nurses, their faces etched with past fear, confirmed they had personally witnessed students toiling for excessive hours with minimal, almost non-existent, supervision. And 2 former students from previous graduating classes, their voices trembling with long-suppressed pain, provided horrifyingly detailed accounts of their own experiences, mirroring precisely every accusation I had made. But the most devastating blow came when a former administrator from the nursing school, a conscience finally stirring, discreetly contacted Jennifer Walsh. They provided irrefutable internal emails explicitly detailing the dark financial benefits of maximizing student work hours and outlining cold, cynical strategies for evading regulatory scrutiny. The institution's pathetic attempts to paint me as an isolated, emotionally unstable malcontent crumbled into dust, utterly demolished by the overwhelming, irrefutable corroboration from multiple independent sources. The federal investigations, fueled by the relentless media spotlight and the unassailable mountain of documentation I had meticulously compiled, moved with astonishing, almost unprecedented speed. Within a mere 2 weeks, investigators had unearthed damning financial records that incontrovertibly confirmed the illegal payment arrangements festering between the hospital and the nursing school. They found scheduling systems that meticulously documented systematic violations of student work hour limits, and chilling email communications that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that administrators at both institutions were fully aware they were brazenly violating both educational standards and fundamental labor laws. The Department of Education, acting swiftly and decisively, suspended Riverside Nursing Academy's accreditation pending a full-blown, uncompromising investigation, while the Department of Labor filed scathing charges against St. Mary's Hospital for egregious labor law violations. Both Director Hartwell and Pat Morrison, their carefully constructed worlds crumbling around them, were immediately placed on administrative leave, their professional lives in ruins, as criminal investigations began into their central roles in the systematic long-standing exploitation of countless students. The personal cost of my decision to shatter the silence was significant, a brutal, unforgiving price, yet one I bore with unwavering resolve. I was unceremoniously terminated from my position at St. Mary's Hospital, the official reasons a cynical smokescreen, violating confidentiality agreements, and creating a hostile work environment. But the wrongful termination lawsuit, swiftly filed by my formidable attorney, was settled quickly and definitively in my favor. The hospital, trapped in a maelstrom of negative publicity, wisely realized that fighting me would only invite further scrutiny, further condemnation. More importantly, amidst the wreckage, a beacon of hope. 3 other hospitals in the region, their leadership demonstrating genuine integrity, reached out to offer me positions. Recognizing that my unwavering willingness to expose institutional rot made me precisely the kind of principled, brave employee they desperately wanted on their staff. Emma's recovery, both her physical healing and the slow, arduous mending of her emotional wounds, accelerated dramatically once the truth detonated. Once she finally understood that her suffering wasn't a personal failure, but the brutal, calculated consequence of systemic abuse. "Mom," she confided, her voice filled with a fragile, renewed hope. "For the first time since starting nursing school, I remember why I wanted to become a nurse. You showed me, truly showed me, what it means to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves." 6 months after that pivotal television interview, the ripples of our story continued to expand, transforming into a mighty tide of change. The Federal Task Force on Student Exploitation, directly spurred by our case, had identified disturbingly similar predatory programs flourishing at healthcare education institutions across the entire country, leading to widespread investigations and fundamental reforms that would, undoubtedly, safeguard thousands of future students from similar fates. Ashley Chen, the brave former student whose desperate complaint had been so callously dismissed years earlier, was justly hired as a consultant, her hard-won experience invaluable in helping develop robust new oversight mechanisms for clinical education programs. Emma, her spirit rekindled, returned to nursing with a renewed sense of purpose, but this time within a legitimate program, blessed with proper supervision and reasonable hours, her passion for healing finally untainted by exploitation. As for me, I discovered my true calling as a fierce advocate for student rights in healthcare education, collaborating tirelessly with regulatory agencies and educational institutions. My unwavering goal to ensure that the monstrous injustice inflicted upon Emma's class would never, ever happen again. The 6 simple words I had spoken on live television, "They're stealing our children's futures for profit," had, against all odds, become a powerful rallying cry, echoing across the nation, empowering countless students and parents who, like us, were demanding unwavering accountability from institutions that had tragically forgotten their sacred educational mission in their insatiable, merciless pursuit of financial gain. Looking back on that terrifying day when Emma collapsed during her graduation ceremony, I now understand, with profound clarity, that it was both a devastating ending and a powerful, transformative beginning. It was the crushing end of my naive, unquestioning trust in institutions I had faithfully served for years, institutions I had believed were bastions of integrity. But it was also the exhilarating, terrifying beginning of a far more meaningful career, one singularly dedicated to fiercely protecting the next generation of healthcare workers, the bright, hopeful souls who would follow in Emma's footsteps. Emma often tells me, with a quiet, profound wisdom, that her collapse, as agonizing as it was ultimately the best thing that ever happened to her, because it led, against all odds, to the public exposure of a brutal, insidious system that would have otherwise continued its predatory exploitation of students for years, perhaps decades to come. I have learned through blood and tears that sometimes the most monumental act you can perform is simply to utter 6 simple words, words that carry a truth so stark, so blindingly clear, that it becomes utterly impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to bury. In a world where institutional power often crushes and silences individual voices, sometimes all it takes is one ordinary person, one brave soul, willing to articulate precisely what everyone already knows, what everyone senses, but what everyone else is too afraid, too intimidated, to acknowledge. The true, enduring victory, I now understand, was not merely stopping the exploitation at 2 specific institutions. It was the undeniable proof that ordinary people, when armed with truth and courage, still possess the power to demand unwavering accountability from the very systems that are supposed to serve them.